Well, good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I'm Felton Thomas, the chair of the board for DPLA. And I want to welcome you to our open board and community meeting today on October 16th. Of course, we want to thank you for joining us, and we have a big day of discussion. Certainly want to thank Sarah Lutman from Eight Bridges Workshop for being with us. She will be the epicenter of all of our discussions today, but we want to start for right now, starting with bringing on Mr. John Bracken, who is our executive director, to kind of put everything into perspective for our discussion today. John?
Welcome, and thank you all for being here. I just wanted to kind of just give as brief as I can update on the last couple of months. It's been a while since we convened as a group here. And just lead with a couple of headlines. And my colleague Kat, I think, is going to help me illustrate some of this with some links in the chat. And thanks to everyone from the board for being here and all of you as external guests. I want to make a note that there's, as many of you know, there's all sorts of complicated and terrible things happening in the world. And a lot of folks are this week are dealing with health issues or family health issues and aren't here today. So just thanking and acknowledging those folks and wishing them the best. So I'll just to give you a sense of some things that we've been up to recently. In July, many of you know, we launched the Banned Book Club, the bannedbookclub.info, as a way to counteract the trend of banning of books that's been happening across the country, really motivated by our core mission, right? And use the possibility of leveraging digital technology to make the banning of books no longer possible. We launched it via the Palace app. And what it does is it ensures that every reader in communities where books have been banned will get an alert and are able to access versions, a banned book library of titles that have been banned in their physical location. And I want to give a special thank you to Kat and Micah from the DPLA team and to the entire lyricist team, the Palace team, that helped make this possible and did the real work to stand this up. As most of you are probably aware, the efforts to ban books are largely at their base efforts to remove Black, brown, and queer narratives and voices from our shelves. And so we are extra motivated as part of our mission to ensure access, especially to projects and voices traditionally denied places or denigrated in projects like ours, to ensure that these stories and voices remain free and accessible to anyone who wants to read them. We were really gratified that that vision and that kickoff of that project prompted a collaboration with the University of Chicago Library, which we launched earlier this month. Man, Kat, you were just on it. You must know, you were just like, as soon as I say it, the link popped. That's amazing. Because of the partnership with the University of Chicago, we are now making, for the state of Illinois, through the University of Chicago Library, all the banned book club library that we've created will be available for all readers in Illinois. And we really feel gratified that their vision for intellectual freedom and ours and the possibility of leveraging digital to obviate the censorship trends have matched up. And I want to acknowledge MacArthur Foundation, which is, whose funds have helped enable that work, and Knight Foundation and Sloan Foundation, whose support have formed the bedrock of what we've been able to do with Palace. Another part of our work around ebooks that I want to highlight, because it feels like an area where our impact is growing and may even expand in the coming months, is our attempts to build bridges between libraries and publishers, right? Out of a notion that there's a shared mission to expand access. And in my optimistic days, not all my days are optimistic, but in my optimistic moments, I think that there's a real possibility in this shared moment of both publishers and authors and libraries coming together to push back against the attempts to censor books and censor authors, to open up possibilities around our shared missions to create access to knowledge and information. And so the work that we've been doing over the last few years has centered around really pragmatic, on the ground work of finding licensing regimes that work best for libraries and also serve the needs and desires of authors. And so as you know, through Palace, we have agreements with each of the big 5 publishers. We also work with hundreds of smaller and independent publishers. We work with Amazon Publishing. And we found a series of approaches, a variety of approaches that work around licensing. Actually, Kat, I don't know if you've got it, but there's that blog post we did a month ago that kind of lays this out. One of the approaches that we've found momentum around is the notion of a perpetual one at a time license model. And the post that I think Kat's going to throw in kind of articulates that a little bit more fully. We've also been working with publishers to enable libraries to share their actual collections with other libraries. Right, we've seen progress there. One of the more recent conversations we had about this work with librarians and publishers, we did publicly. We did this about 10 days ago as part of our Collaborating for Access series, which is a partnership that we've been doing with Readers First and COSLA, which is the Association of State Librarians. This was the 6th webinar that we've done together across the 3 organizations. And we brought in the Independent Publishers Caucus to talk through how together we can expand access. And part of the motivation for that conversation was towards a fuller in-person meeting that we're collaborating on together in April in Columbus, in the beginning of April, focused on collaborative ways for building sustainable digital collection strategies. And I know a lot of you, and I'm including a couple of you on the board whose faces I can see, have been deeply involved in that work over the years. I think we're going to see more opportunities to drive that conversation forward in ways that are really pragmatic and with the goal of getting books in people's hands. And if you're interested, Kat just threw out the link to learn more. Another area of our work that I just wanted to touch on briefly is our collaboration with Wikimedia, or working through the Wikimedia Commons. As many of you know, for a couple of years now, we've been the largest institutional contributor to the Wikimedia Commons. The bulk of that has been images. We're getting close at some point that 4 million images will have been available from our partners in our network, made available in the Wikimedia Commons for use in Wikipedia and other Wikimedia projects. We recently, with the Wikimedia Foundation, our colleague Dominic Bird McDevitt collaborated on an overview of our work, our kind of approach towards structured data. God, I feel like I've just got a DJ. I got a link DJ here next to me, throwing these things up as I make the references. That work is continuing to grow. A lot of you have been involved in it. And in fact, one of the, as I pivot to talk about the things we've got teed up for the next month, one of those is a specific case study around our Wikimedia work with our partners at the Ohio Digital Network and Columbus Metro Library. And that's coming up, and I'm going to blank the date, but it's coming up in a couple of weeks with live guided editing. And I guess, there are a couple other projects just coming up in the next month or so, just to highlight. You can always go to events.dp.la if you want to see the list of what we're up to. But and I should say that Wikimedia project is with the Wikimedia Working Group. The Outreach and Assessment Working Group is hosting a session around teaching and learning with DPLA resources. Kat, I'm not even going to try to name all the dates, because I know you're throwing them in here for folks that are interested in registering. The metadata working group is going to be reporting out a best practices report that they solicited from the network later this month. And the digital curation task force is hosting a conversation, a brown bag conversation on curating digital content, a coffee chat that we've branded them coffee chats, early next month. So those are, some of the things that the team has going on. To build off of, how Felton introduced the conversation, I think the other big thing that we've been doing that many of you have been part of is in August, we announced, and in September, we launched the first part of a strategic visioning process. Our last strategic plan we completed in 2019. So that feels like a long time ago, particularly with a project called the Digital Public Library of America, and with this broad mission to think broadly and about the field. That 2019, a lot's changed since then. We decided to start the visioning process with a program assessment of our work, aggregating and presenting digital material. And so we engaged 8Bridges and Sarah Lutman, who's here, who at this point I think has conducted about 30 interviews. Many of you I see on here have been on that list, and Sarah will share out that list. So thank you all for being part of that. I want to underline, this is not Sarah's final report. This is not a final presentation. What we wanted to do, knowing that this meeting was coming up, we wanted to leverage this meeting as an opportunity for Sarah to present a snapshot of an overview of what she's heard and thought and learned so far through those first conversations. So this conversation that comes up that we'll have this afternoon, I hope, is the first of a set of conversations and not the last part. And I guess I'll just say the last part, what we're building towards is our next, the board retreat that we have in January, where we'll present a set of recommendations about next steps. I guess the last thing I'll say before I'll hand it over back to the board is in the blog post where we kind of kicked this off. I said that we were starting this project open-minded with no fixed endpoint in mind. And in looking back on that, easier said than done, right? That's a pretty easy statement to make, but I acknowledge and realize that making a leap like that, the sort of, imagining what a future could be and the changes that could come with that is unsettling. And it's been unsettling for all of us on the team. And I know for a lot of you as well. And I guess I just want to shout out the team. Concurrent to this, we've had a lot of staff departures and turnover, and I think that makes it even more unsettling. And I just appreciate the forbearance and the work that the team's done, and the grace of the folks who have been our partners through all this as we go through this process. And I want to thank and acknowledge the folks, again, a lot of you on this call, who both on the board and not on the board, who helped really push for us to take this process and ask these sets of questions. This work's been being guided by a board task force that Joe Lucia, Marshall Walker McWilliams, Josh Fraser Sparks, and Elaine Westbrooks, who's not here today, that they've been helping to guide it and give some advice as we craft this. And I'm gonna ask Joe, maybe before we hand the con over to Sarah for her update, if he wanted to say something as one of the people who helped kind of ground this even before you were on the board, Joe.
Yeah. Thanks, John. Yeah, I'll try and be brief. So John and I have been having conversations for a number of years about the sort of the history of our metadata aggregation work, and the sort of the vision that DPLA was launched with as being a kind of a public center enterprise to organize and present to the world at large the sort of cultural memory materials that our organizations have curated, digitized, and shared out. And There was a lot of energy, as you all know, in the early days of this project, about a little more than a decade ago, and a lot of volunteer effort across the entire landscape of cultural memory organizations. And there were some, at least initially, reasonably robust investments in supporting that work. And as time marched on and that initial energy and enthusiasm kind of waned, and as the funding models themselves started to attenuate, it's been clear that there's been kind of, I would say, some disillusionment, some loss of idealism, and also maybe some waning of enthusiasm in the community at large. And the question in front of the board was, where do we go with this work? Do we carry it forward? How do we get a reading on what the community believes is possible? How do we get a better sense of what the underlying participation and financial models could look like, given that we have tried a number of things, and each one of those iterations of the approach we've taken to this sort of distributed metadata hub framework has been hard to sustain. So we've hit a moment where we need to take I think a completely honest and deep survey of the work and of the people who've been doing the work, and of people in our field broadly construed, who can offer a perspective and opinion on what we've done so far, what we carry forward from those early days, and what might need to be different in 2023 than it was in maybe 2012, 2013. So Sarah and 8 Bridges has done a lot of really great research on that in terms of person-to-person reach into our community, and I think that's probably enough context. So this is really a community survey to understand where we are with this work, and to inform the future conversation that John mentioned about where we might go with it, and what it might look like in the next decade, if we decide it's an activity that we need to sustain in some form that's similar to what we've done in the past. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Great, thank you very much, Joe, and welcome everybody. It's good to see a nice sized group here, including some people that I met with for this project so far. I need to share my screen, don't I? That would help. Here we go. Does that look approximately correct? Ta-da! Are you seeing?
Sarah?
Okay, great. So I'll be talking for about 15 minutes, and the course of the conversation will be what my scope of work is, what interviews we've completed so far, themes that I've drawn from the work, and a timeline for what comes next. And then the board will take it back again, and Felton will lead us in a discussion. So this is really the Cultural Heritage Aggregation Program Assessment. This was not a full-on assessment of everything DPLA has done, its staffing structure. It wasn't a full organizational assessment. And we kind of started out with a large DPLA staff aggregated a nice collection of documents for us to learn about the history of this work and what has been done and communicated to date. And this is just a few bullet points of reminder that DPLA was launched with $15 million in startup planning and the ambitious vision that Joe just described. And at the time, projections estimated that an operating budget of $3 to $5 million would be needed to sustain the work. And at its very peak staffing, DPLA had 15 full-time employees. Now, 12 years later, DPLA has organized a substantial network of state and regional librarians and helped more than 5,000 organizations share content. with almost 50 million items available. And more recently, equity grants have supported the inclusion of underrepresented collections. Curated resource sets have helped organize the collection. And significant effort has been applied to fundraising that unfortunately has not resulted in new support. And that leads us to why DPLA must now determine how to further scale and sustain the effort. And even though probably you all know this, I think it's important to just ground ourselves in where we started from and what the developmental curve has looked like. So this is, I'm not going to read this slide, but just so you know, this was the scope I was given, and our current activities are probably the ones to focus on, which is engagement with stakeholders to understand needs and priorities for digital access, and DPLA's role in providing this. Our engagement as Bridges is through January to work with the organization on findings and recommendations, but those will guide further planning next year. So the interview list, because whenever you present themes from interviews, they came from the people you talked to, and of course they didn't come from the people you didn't talk to. So DPLA put the interview list together in order to focus on individuals involved in the networks, including staff, alumni, and board members, network leads and members, partners, and a smaller number of field observers. But most of these people have had a long-term relationship with DPLA's cultural heritage aggregation work. The reason I'm smiling is my office is next door to a violin shop, and it's just inevitable that whenever I start presenting on Zoom, somebody comes in to try violins and play them. So if you hear music in the background, that's what you're hearing. So this is the interview list thus far, and I'll just pause a minute so that you can see who's here. I don't want to read them all. It's been really fun, actually. Super energetic, dedicated people. And now I will launch into the themes that I've drawn from talking to folks. And the first one is this group of interviewees described the cultural heritage aggregation work as DPLA's distinctive contribution and its core identity. For this group, this work is DPLA. And when you ask about programs, they don't talk about other things. So here are a few direct quotes. And again, I'm not going to read them again, all to you, but just the first one. Their aggregation of cultural content was what has made DPLA different and important. They do this amazingly well. The technical, intellectual, and logistical challenges of bringing together content from many hubs and members and getting it into a system is actually amazing. And then if you look at the second from the bottom, DPLA brings together people and resources from all across the country, highlights the treasures that we hold, raising awareness of digital objects as primary resource materials, especially for our history. So that's our theme number one. The prompting question was, what does DPLA do well? Where have they had the greatest impact? So the second theme is, beyond the importance of the work itself, people describe the value in having built a network of people committed to the work. And the network of people, for some interviewees, is even more important than the aggregation of the objects. So some quotes here. DPLA helps to connect people who are doing the archives work. When we joined, we realized everyone is grappling with common problems. Building the network of people is a huge contribution as much as the collection of material. And then they bring people together. They're good at that. and networks they've built are cohesive and tight, and people really care about them. And I'll just pause here for a second while you read the next other ones. So next up, DPLA's waning resources and the apparent deprioritizing of the work disappoints constituents and raises questions about the value of membership fees and network participation. DPLA's seeming ambivalence is leading to workarounds and possible new entrants. Now, Joe didn't mention that there was a preview of this slide deck last week, and some of this is a little bit hard for DPLA to hear, and I want to acknowledge that while sharing some of the quotes on the next page. I don't really feel a sense of partnership with them anymore. If they could divest of the aggregation, they would. It's hard to justify the cost of membership. And then look at what Mellon is funding. Much of it is DPLA-like. And what they're referring to there are the many grants the Mellon Foundation is making in their public knowledge programming. So this is interviewees openly recognizing that because of fewer staff, fewer resources, the sense that DPLA's interest in the work has diffused. And our next theme was people suggesting that aggregating up the profusion of cultural heritage materials may be less important now than efforts toward curation and use. People describe sense-making and building pathways to use as future roles and key contributions. So if you think about it, they're a random collection of stuff. It would have to be much more curated and edited and researched to give it pedagogical impact. And then making sense of America's cultural heritage is what's needed now. The body of work that's incredibly important is the education piece. Primary source sets on the website are a major incentive for people to engage with the material. And then acknowledging that the Wikimedia work is a game changer because the amount of traffic it generates, and we know immediately that our materials are being used. So moving right along, timing is critical as observers experience DPLA's position as precarious. Careful communication around decisions and a solution that honors the efforts and the work to date from all across the United States will ensure that DPLA retains a leadership position and credibility in the field. So here are some of the more tough ones. Should they exist? That's worth asking. They're not doing anything particularly well right now. They have an uncertain identity. They have bursts of inspiration that create energy, but what holds it together? And then I would love to see DPLA take the stage and own it. Better to burn out than fade away. So finally, when asked how DPLA might scale and sustain the cultural heritage work, most interviewees propose partnerships as a potential solution. And this is what some of the exploration that we will be doing together in the coming months. So again, our timeline, we already did August, September, and October. November, we're going to continue discussions, refine options and outcomes. And then in December, draft and refine recommendations, begin to discuss them with our committee. Oh, I see our S got a little messed up here in presentation mode. And then for the January 19th Board of Directors retreat to submit our final report. So thus ends this slide deck, and I think we go back to me stopping sharing and hand things over to Felton for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think you're right. A lot of that it's hard to take in, but it's important. And thank you for the work that you've done so far for us. I wanted to ask the board task force, and once again, the board overall thanks Joe, Marcia, Josh, and Elaine for all of their work. I want to ask Joe, Marcia, Joe, Marcia, or Josh right now to chime in. Joe's already had an opportunity, so let's start with Marcia or Josh to add anything they'd like to add in, if they have anything they'd like to add in before we go and ask some questions of the general participants.
Hey, Felton, I'll just jump in and say we really appreciate the feedback that we've heard from you. If you were on the line and participated in an interview, we really appreciate that. We, as you know, we're in a phase of really determining the future, and we can't do that without you. So thank you for that, and we'll keep you up to date as things progress.
Marcia, anything you want to add?
No, I mean, my sentiments echo Josh's. I'm really interested to hear what, folks on the call have to say. If there's additional feedback or questions or areas of inquiry that are of interest to the network, how it is we can go about, having more discussion, even as difficult as it is, to really come about a viable solution for our partners in the organization.
And so I think what we have it situated, John, is that we're going to ask for folks to put their questions in the chat, right? So if you have questions for Sarah or any of the folks on the task force, please put your questions in the chat. Sarah, I think one of the questions that I think, was certainly or statements that was put forward is the sense that DPLA has this great opportunity, and the sense of we may not be taking advantage of it. And it seems like you heard that ongoing. What did you take out of that in your interviews?
Well, when there has been specific funding for things like equity grants or primary source sets and the development of the material beyond just if I could call it the ingestion of material, people have really appreciated that work and they miss it and would like to see it come back. So it's really on this question of utilization. It's one thing to aggregate, and actually I think that's one of the highlights people mention of the Wikimedia work is just the effort that it took them may have been challenging for some of the networks, but the reward is that they can really see that the material is being just used not even tenfold, it's more than tenfold from what they were getting before.
Yeah, I think that's one of the difficulties is sometimes we're brought in on different space, and this was brought up in the questions. We do have one question, but I want to bring this again to you. If you kind of speak to this, that there is this sense that DPLA is taking on all of these different challenges that come before it and not focusing on what many of the folks in the network want us to focus on. But, as you said, there are these things that come along that do have and bring more attention to the network in general.
Well, I'm empathetic with those organizations that are largely, their business model is largely around foundation funding, because even the most dedicated foundation decides to change its focus area over time. And so you have a very long-term project aggregating America's cultural heritage, not a small or short-term activity. And yet it's matched with not revenue engine that matches it in terms of its sustainability. And people recognize that. But the result of needing to constantly get new foundation grants for new subjects leads people to feel like they're not the latest thing anymore.
So
Did that
now
answer your question?
yes, very much so. Thanks, Sarah. So we do have a couple of questions that were put forward in the Q&A. So this goes to the task force or to the board at large. The board will hear this in their January retreat. When can DPLA partners expect to hear the outcome of this study?
I'm going to give that one to John Bracken or
Yes.
to you, Felton.
Well,
Go ahead, Felton.
well,
Let's see
I
if we have
was
the
again saying that we would hope to be able to be as transparent as soon as possible with the information that is brought forward to us. So, you know, as soon as the next community meeting would be available, we'd like to bring that to the community. But John, did you have any other?
Yeah, I would say, you know, Sarah's timeline ended on January 19th, which is the date for the board meeting. And I think that's a good question. And I don't have the answer for that yet, but I would think whatever, you know, comes out of that meeting on January 19th, we would try to, you know, roll out shortly and in short order, right? This wouldn't be a thing we would, you know, wait a year to roll out, and we're not. I mean, we haven't talked about this. I don't know that we're publishing this in any format, right? And there's not a conference we're trying to hold off on sharing it with. So, my expectation, not having talked with the board about it, but my expectation based on the tenor of the conversations we've been having with the task force is, you know, we want to be responsible and timely and transparent. And so I would expect, you know, we'd be talking days, weeks, not months after January 19th, I think. But again, that's the first time we've not addressed that, but that's a good question. I hope that helps.
So this, and in essence, it will be as soon as we possibly can. So, the second question, in 2018, DPLA made specific and targeted staffing decisions to devalue the curation work. Joe said that the work has lost steam from the partners, but is that truly the case, or is that DPLA has stopped valuing the work and it's been difficult to sustain? For example, DPLA stopped the primary source of exhibition work in 2017. In addition, DPLA is not doing any work to market or promote the portal as they have in the past. Will DPLA consider this work important again? Instead, DPLA is just focusing on other unrelated ebook projects. Well, first of all, Joe, your name was mentioned in this, so I don't know if you want to make sure you have a chance to respond.
Yeah, I will add a few thoughts. I mean, because you know, I think what the questioner is pointing to is that, you know, really there's multiple factors that I think have resulted in the current situation. You know, I want to say also that I think the assumption that some of the other work that DPLA is doing recently detracts from the aggregation work from the standpoint of someone on the board and who has seen the kind of evolution of that work. It's still, I would say, in the same general mission space, and it's also to some degree about finding ways potentially to build at least a modest underlying economic framework to support the ongoing work of the organization. But to the point of, you know, kind of, let's say, exhaustion or disillusionment in the field, in my own backyard at Temple University, you know, we have hosted the Pennsylvania Hub for about a decade, and initially we had a really robust infusion of funding from our Commonwealth library system, and after maybe 4 or 5 years, that dialed down, and we continued to carry the work forward with reduced funding and with volunteer labor from from within my organization. And, there's this sort of, I think the emotional lift of carrying that work forward with less and less financial support and what seemed to be a diminishing level of engagement from the partners that originally put money behind this, in particular the state library in Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth Library, has led to just a kind of emotional exhaustion at the level of the network itself. And I've heard from others in other regions where this work has had a similar kind of path with funding and support that's diminished over time, that there has been a kind of just a loss of morale, a loss of engagement. And I don't know, I just don't think you can ascribe that to the central DPLA enterprise. It's been a distributed organization from the very beginning, with distributed effort and kind of a strong underlying, ideological commitment to the value of this work across the landscape, the cultural and social value of it. And it's the reality is that in our particular field, there's people are asked to give a lot to support the public good, but at some point, when there's not some perceived reciprocity, there is an emotional burden that gets hard to sustain. And I think that's the reality, that we've come to a point where we need to think again about how we do this and what the sources of support are. So I don't think it's really just about a change in the central DPLA office. I mean, the reality is that when John walked in this situation, we were on we were in a financial spiral, I think, right? We were in a place where there was not revenues to sustain the staffing that was in place. And I don't think that was about willfully changing the trajectory. It was about making it possible to carry the work forward with the means that we had. And John, I'll turn it back to you on that, because I don't know the inside details, but I do think that there was a reality there that was difficult to adjust to.
Yes, that's accurate.
All right, well, let's move to the next question, which is, are there opportunities to work toward a different business model, one that doesn't rely primarily on foundation funding? For example, could membership fees ever support the aggregation and curation work? Which I think, goes into Joe's discussion and Joe's point. And one point that I think, John, you really need to speak to is the fact that you're the one out there doing the fundraising and trying to find these funds for this. And there's a reason that, we have found other things that are more, that have the interest of funders than the network.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question. And I think, part of the outcome for this discussion and the board discussion that I'm hoping for is to solidify what are the questions and process, what are we taking on, what are we asking Sarah to help us explore in the next 100 days as we wrap up this process. And I think that's a key question. And Sarah can speak to this more because she's seen various versions of this. I do know from DPLA's founding, we knew that depending on foundation support, we knew the premise of that question, and I don't know who asked it. You might have been at the tables during some of those early discussions. The premise of that question was, part of the founding conversations, right? That first meeting we had in Cambridge, looking at the notes, it was with a lot of foundations at the table. There was an acknowledgement that long-term we would not be able to sustain a project dependent on foundation support, in no small part due to some of the points Sarah made around changing priorities. And so we've been aware of that throughout, and things like the membership program, which a lot of you helped craft here in this room, and things like the revenue that we've been able to generate from the ebooks sales and licensing, in part have been efforts to try to build a second and a third leg of those stools. So yeah, I mean, yes, it's a good question. And I don't know, Sarah, you've seen this movie more in different contexts more often. And I think in my career, I've never talked to one, nonprofit CEO who just is satisfied just to live off of foundation support, right? It's a constant. It's not a sustained effort.
I don't really have a lot to add other than quite a few of the networks. I don't have a count in my mind, so this won't be a data-rich comment, but said that it was hard to justify the membership fee, whether or not there was value derived, but just based on their own stretched thin budgets and the amount that membership fees are going up elsewhere. And also the recognition that in this instance, it's almost there, you don't join to get a service, you join to help the service be provided, which is a different value proposition. John could probably spend an afternoon with a spreadsheet and figure out how much membership fees would have to go up to pay for a robust aggregation function and share that out. I mean, we honestly didn't do that, but I don't think it would be a number that would make very many people happy.
Can I just jump in here and say a couple of years ago in Pennsylvania, in terms of the Pennsylvania Hub, we did some community engagement work facilitated by Jill Morris from PALC, and asked that question of our members: who of you would put money into a common fund to support the membership at a state or hub level? And very few institutions raised their hand, and the money that they were willing to put forward was not enough to achieve a membership participation level that could really fund DPLA if you modeled it out as a national membership framework. So I think that, to me, that's kind of the community's answered that question implicitly.
So we do have a couple more questions, both toward you, Sarah. First
Yep.
being, will 8 Bridges be interviewing staff from newer hubs? This person says, we are still engaged and think it's possible to revive engagement nationwide. And then they were hoping also to be able, someone was hoping to see the list of interviewees again.
Well, on the second question first, we're planning to share the deck, are we not, John? With this group, right?
I was, yeah, I mean, I was anticipating someone asking that, and I think if you're comfortable with, if you're intellectual property, Ms. Lutman and 8 Bridges, but I know folks would appreciate seeing it, so.
Yeah, and here is the list again, just for now. I'll pause on it for a second. And while it's up here, I'll answer the question of whether we're going to have further interviews. Not to kick it to you, John, but that's really how I spend my time, is really up to you. So we have quite a trove of things to follow up on that came out of the interviews we've done so far. And you probably know it shows up as an anonymous question, but I think if you feel like you have important ideas to contribute to this inquiry, that's the whole reason we're having this meeting, so that we could hear from people, and we would certainly want to hear your ideas for what might be possible.
One way
I can
to
put
do that,
I could put my email in the webinar chat. I just feel bad for doing it because when you do it, you're going to get my out of office almost immediately because I'm going on a trip. But I'll give it to you. There. Now I'm scared.
So I think
must be
those
more
2 questions have been
questions.
answered. Does anyone have any further questions that they'd like to raise? Because I think it's been valuable, the questions that you've been able to provide us. I think finally, I would ask.
There is a new
task
question.
force. Oh, there seems to be one more added here. let's go with this final one here. Have the grant organizations given any specific reasons why they haven't been willing to continue funding the aggregation project? Are there things that could be done without compromising the project that would make them more inclined to consider funding it? I think that's a John Bracken question.
It is. It could also be a Sarah question, because Sarah, among her different hats, she also works with a lot of funders. I would say, we have not held back at all in engaging with funders. I think one of the challenges we've had, when frankly where we've not succeeded, with a couple of exceptions, is expanding the list of funders supporting our work, right? And I think, and Joe and others can speak more to this. I mean, building off some of the points Joe shared, when we launched, there was momentum and interest on multiple funders for supporting the type of infrastructure work that we were articulating. We kind of, the vision that we laid out. That's not the case now. And actually, let me see if I can find the phrase. Oh, sorry, I lost the exact phrasing of the question. I think so. And I'll repeat something I've said before: is we've not turned down any funding at any point, right? Just to be totally clear. And we're aware that, funders, have their own desires and agendas. And part of our job is to articulate our vision in ways where, without compromising the project or our values or our mission, we're not changing our mission of expanding access, is to, tell that story in ways that fit with funders. And so, we're in active dialogue with a set of funders right now, which, some of which I'm feeling pretty optimistic about, some of which maybe might not come to the fore, and that's, going to continue. But anyway, I alluded to Joe's points that he made earlier, and Sarah, I know you do. This is a big part of just your work generally, which is part of what you bring to the table with this conversation.
Well, it's just difficult because foundations, there may be some on the lines who want to be a little bit circumspect in my remarks about foundation behavior, but there's a blogger named Vu Lee you could read who doesn't hold back about how he perceives foundation behavior with respect to things like core operating support needs or sustaining things that need continued funding, especially in areas where there's a lack of resources to start with. If you get a 10-year run with a foundation, that's pretty good. And there are, unfortunately, it was very inspiring to go back. I remember when DPLA was first formed, the sort of foment around the internet about at the time that we could create a utopian environment where everyone had access to the knowledge and resources, and a number of organizations were formed to ensure that. And the entire context of what's happening on the internet now seems to need that thinking more than ever. And yet, when you see philanthropy's interest in investing in, I would say, not only DPLA, but a range of other stakeholders we could name, it seems to have waned, despite reasons why it should be flourishing. I don't know if that's what you were expecting me to say, John, but. Not
All right.
knowing the truth.
Got this one. Responding to Joe's comment about knowing what the true sustaining membership cost would be, I think that's a useful number. When we talk to our hub stakeholders, it's hard to say what's too expensive without numbers. Yeah, I mean, I think, Joe, did you want to add something to this?
Well, I would say that it's probably a significantly higher number than we're currently paying for the hub memberships because that's not enough revenue to sustain. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that's around $10,000 right now for a hub, right? So,
10 to 15, yeah.
you might want to. I mean, I think to get to sustainability and really have revenue that could generate a dynamic and growing organization, you might need to triple that number or maybe even quadruple it, to be honest. I mean, and so, call it $40,000 to $50,000 a year for a hub membership to generate enough revenue across the landscape. I do not see that money in our sector right now. Every time I talk to people about what they can give, they don't want to give because they feel like that it's giving into something, it's giving money to something that they say does not necessarily add local value to their institutional mission or their community mission. So it becomes a trade-off that they're not willing to make. That's the bottom line as I see it.
Yeah, that's the difficult question. And I think this will be our last question of the day. Oh, just as I say that, another jumps in. But let's look at this one. This is to you. It said Sarah mentioned in one of her final slides that institutional partnerships were a repeated focus of the stakeholder interviews. Have there been recent discussions about moving DPLA to a sustainable institutional home as a national digital library?
I'll let John take that one.
Yes. Mr. Bracken.
Sorry, I also was reading the question right below it, which is a big question. I mean, I would say as we're exploring scenarios, that feels like it's a potential scenario, right? I mean, I think I was on a call with a group of folks from the advisory council recently, and I think that there's a range of actions that possibilities we could take on. And like I said at the outset, we entered this with no preconditions, right? We really want to explore everything that's possible. I think, fundamentally, as the question suggests, everything we do is a partnership or collaboration in some way. And so is there a better way to organize this work? And is there a better way to organize it in partnership with some of the entities that are on this call? I think that's I anticipate that being one of the projects we take on in the next few weeks. So I think that's part of the scenarios that we're going to explore as we develop a set of recommendations. But again, I turn that back to the board too. This is a discussion we haven't had yet, but I think that's, I'm willing to explore anything that advances our mission.
Which I think goes to the final comment, which is like, the visioning process and the sustainable funding issue are a bit of a chicken and an egg. We can fully articulate a strategic vision without knowing we have the revenue to support it. Is it the goal of the board in January to articulate the vision or to explore business models to support the existing work? And the answer is yes and yes, right? That's what the work is. And, we're very fortunate to have Sarah working with us on that and us trying to figure out where we go from here. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. Let's see, there was just one last comment put here. With an idea about the fact that there was an example of the DPOE network started at the Library of Congress and has found an academic home. So thank everyone for joining us today. Appreciate the comments, the questions. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. To all my fellow board members, thank you all for your work, your efforts, and we will see you next time. Thank you.